Good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us for One Book, One Boulder, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, a conversation with Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Katharine Wilkinson. I'm David Farnan, Library and Arts Director for the City of Boulder. Since its inception in 1974, the Boulder Library Foundation has sought to provide funding for services that help Boulder residents to develop and grow and to prepare for a more engaged future through our library and beyond. Funding a transformational program like One Book One Boulder is only possible with the generous help and support of the Boulder Library Foundation and our donors. I'd like to thank the foundation and our donors for that support. To find out more, I invite you to visit boulderlibraryfoundation.org. Over the last 3 months, we've had the opportunity to read All We Can Save, engage in a series of programs such as book circles, panel discussions, films, a teen summit, story times for children, and outdoor workshops for all. It is our sincere hope that by participating, you've gained the tools needed to grow and equip yourself to take action on climate crisis. Tonight promises to offer an opportunity to learn and reflect and to be inspired to take action in your community. I'd now like to introduce Lisa Gardner, our moderator for this evening. Lisa leads educational resource development at UCAR Center for Science Education, developing K-12 curriculum, exhibit and website content to help people of all ages learn about the science of our planet. She is the author of Tales from an Uncertain World: What Other Assorted Disasters Can Teach Us About Climate Change. Welcome, Lisa, and please enjoy the conversation this evening.
Thank you very much, David. I'm so glad to be here. As a quick reminder, as we're getting started, library conduct guidelines apply to online events too. And so there's a link in the chat if you need to learn more about that. Our speakers for this evening are the editors of All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And I honestly can think of no better time to be talking about this book, because right now, as we're speaking, actually they're probably asleep, but world leaders are in Scotland for COP26, the United Nations climate meeting, and hopefully searching for consensus on emissions reductions. And this brilliant anthology, All We Can Save, is about the climate crisis and the work to solve it. And it has the voices of about 60 women within the essays and poems and illustrations within the book. It's a national bestseller. It was named one of the best books of the year by Smithsonian Magazine. And there's this fantastic quote from Mashable about it that says, "A fiery, hopeful manifesto on how to make sense of the staggering loss posed by climate change and take a justice-oriented action in spite of it." I really love that description, so I wanted to read it verbatim. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for this evening, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Katharine Wilkinson, the editors of All We Can Save. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be with you, Lisa.
To tell our audience a little bit more about you two, and hopefully not embarrass you. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is a marine biologist, policy expert, a writer, and a Brooklyn native. And she is co-founder of the Urban Ocean Lab, and co-creator of the amazing podcast, How to Save a Planet, which is about climate solutions and thankfully our planet, Earth. And Dr. Katharine Wilkinson.
It's a really good planet. We should try.
I know. I'm really glad you focused on this one. I mean, I assume you had your choice of planets, and you could not have picked a better one. Dr. Katharine Wilkinson is an author, strategist, and teacher working to heal the planet we call home. Also Earth, thank you. In addition to All We Can Save, her books include the Drawdown to Review and Drawdown, some of my favorite resources to point people towards when they're looking for solutions. And she was the lead writer for both of those books. She also co-hosts a podcast called A Matter of Degrees, which has wonderful storytelling in it. So thank you both for being here, and welcome to the virtual version of Boulder, Colorado.
It's looking pretty flat from here. I was expecting more like topography.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're sort of in the indoor Boulder at the moment. Yeah, someday we'll host you in person and go to the outdoor Boulder. But for tonight's program, we're gonna hear about the making of this incredible book. And I haven't interviewed people who've edited an anthology before, so I'm kind of curious to know how that happened. And then Katharine and Ayana are going to share some poetry from the book and answer questions submitted by One Book One Boulder book circles. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question. We have a list of questions. We've combined some people's questions, and we hope you enjoy that part. And then we're going to finish up with a public Q&A. So if you're participating online, please share your questions and comments via YouTube or Facebook Live, whichever platform you're on, throughout the event tonight for Ayana and Katharine, and we're going to answer those later in the program. But now let's talk about the making of this wonderful thing. So I'm really curious how this book came to be and how you brought together so many amazing voices. And I'm wondering, to just start off, could you both share a little bit about what inspired you to make this book?
Should I start? I was inspired by Katharine's rage.
Oh, inspired by rage. That's a powerful force. Yeah.
Like, what the hell is wrong with everyone? Why aren't they listening to all these incredible people doing really important work? And I was like, so I guess I was so sort of like, I guess this is the way the world is, just a bunch of white men controlling everything forever. And Katharine was like, this will not stand. And I was like, oh, right, this will not stand.
That's great. So fury, that, yeah, we could all use some more of that sometimes.
Yeah.
Anything
and actually,
to add, Katharine?
Colorado actually features in this moment of rage entertainment. We were together. It was only, I think, the second time Ayana and I had met in person, and we were together at a conference in Colorado, and feeling frustrated about who was there, who wasn't there, the solutions that were focused on, the solutions that were not present. And so took some of that frustration away from the conference and onto a hike, kind of tromping along a river in an aspen grove, which feels actually like a very appropriate place for thinking about a kind of multi-vocal project like this book. Many different trees, one big community. So that was really
That's so interesting.
the origin.
I love the analogy, because aspen trees their roots are connected, and I feel like you put together a book of all these very different women's voices, but when I got to the end of it, I was like, wow, but they're all connected. They're all sort of in conversation. And I was really struck by that. And I'm wondering, what did you learn after, all these voices came together? Did anything strike you or surprise you about that?
So many of the pieces were written specifically for this book. So lots of anthologies are taking prior writings and compiling them. In this case, there are some of those that were reworked for this book, but the majority of the essays are new writing. And so in a lot of ways, we didn't know where the book was going until we had all of the pieces together. And it was a book that came together quite quickly. It was 9 months from when we started curating to publication. for any other future anthology editors out there, it is not a timeline we would recommend. But I think there was some magic in it because it was so able to meet the moment in which it landed. And I was really struck by the capacity that you see in every single one of these pieces to hold the multiple challenging truths of this moment. And in a lot of ways, that is reflected in the title of the book, which we had a very hard time naming this. We have a whole spreadsheet of names that we can all be very grateful that did not become the title of the anthology. But our editor at One World, Nicole Counts, sent us some lines of Adrienne Rich poetry. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And that phrasing of all we can save acknowledges implicitly all that we have already lost, all the losses that are going to come because of the conditions that now exist in our atmosphere, but refuse to give up. Right. And continues to keep this firm, ferocious grasp on what is still possible and how we take care of one another, and do the sort of transformation work that needs doing in our lifetimes. So I think I came away from that final moment when we saw it all come together, just so moved by the capacity that all of these contributors have to look the bad news in the eye and stay in that space of ferocious love and doing this work.
Yeah, I think the subtitle really reflects what we saw as some of the through lines. Just as Katharine was just saying, this like truth, courage, and solutions, right? Like facing the facts. Like there's no sugarcoating in here. We are straight up, addressing the scientific projections as they are presented, and the facts they are, and just thinking about, okay, well, what do we do, right? The fact that I was particularly excited to have the word solutions on the cover, because very rarely is that like a leading framework for how we talk about climate change, and courage, right? As the thing that connects from truth to solutions, as the thing that like keeps us moving forward. And that's something that all of the contributors to the book really brought to this in a way that I don't think we had anticipated that would be so universal across the essays, but in hindsight it makes perfect sense because like we chose the essayists. And so of course we have this bias for people who are like actively dealing with reality and working on what the heck we do about it. Like if I have bias at all in the world, it is that one. A place where Katharine and I certainly come together. Like, who's doing what to fix this?
So that brings up to me something you both mentioned, which is that you brought in the essayists, but you didn't have their work at the beginning. So you were saying, all right, here's our anthology, but there's nothing in it currently. So it's like being an art curator making an exhibit, but the art is being made at the same time that you're curating. How did that go? Were you excited, surprised, not sure what you were gestating here? How was that?
I think you have captured the absurdity of the task that we set out to do.
Okay.
At the time.
I love absurdity. Yeah. Wow. Well, that must have led to some cool surprises, though, right?
There were some cool surprises, and we we had a sense, right, of the kinds of things that people might write about based on the work that they do. So we had that sense because there were, topics that we wanted to make sure were covered in this book. And there were sort of professional backgrounds, and this book focuses on folks who do most of their work in the United States. But we wanted to make sure that we were really covering a spectrum of the geography of this country. And so we were, kind of, we had a very complex spreadsheet of all these things. And ultimately, I think one of the things that really helped the book come together in such a beautiful way, with such a sense of integration, is actually the art that is in the book by Madeline Jubilee Saito, who's now also the creative director at the All We Can Save project. And that was also luck. I saw a tweet from the Sunrise Movement about Madeline's climate comics, and Ayana and I were just totally taken by them. It felt like they captured so much of the spirit, and happily Madeline was game to have them included in the collection.
I was happy to see those too, because I'm also an illustrator, so I always wonder,
cool.
like, why is it all about the words? Like, even in children's books, come on, they're called picture books. Like, they have pictures. And so, yeah, it was wonderful.
And we all are sad when the pictures leave the books, right? It's a very sad thing about growing up, actually.
Yeah. So thank you for the pictures. But yeah. Did you have anything to add to that, Ayana?
I think one of my favorite things about being an editor was helping people who had never told their stories before get them out, right? You have all of these incredible doers who had not stopped to write about all the things they had done, because they were not focused on who was getting credit. They were just focused on, like, how do we shut as many coal plants in the United States as possible yesterday? Right. For example.
So you're asking them to really take a step back.
And share their insights, share their lessons learned, share their personal story of how it all came together. And so that was honestly quite a treat for us both, to get to be the people who helped to draw those stories out and be sort of like egg them on to share their wisdom with the world, because there are a lot of these folks who would not otherwise, without such a prompt, without such support, without such a deadline, without such motivation of having their work be in conversation with all these other remarkable folks, have ever done this. And what a loss that would have been, because they have very important things to say. And so that was something that I hadn't really appreciated when we went into this, was just, how important the invitation is. And that, was one of the things that motivated us to, of course, create the anthology in the first place, was knowing how many people doing great work were not appreciated, did not have the platform they deserved, did not have the resources to support their work, etc. But I just thought it was really cool how excited people got as they were processing the work that they had done and were able to celebrate their own accomplishments and step back and really process what was remarkable about it and worth sharing. It also, to be honest, made the editing a little harder, because these are not writers, right? They are, activists and farmers and lawyers and all of these other, financiers and models and
people with really compelling stories. So
doing the stuff. And so it was a lot of I also had no idea how hard it would be to be an editor. I think we were sort of like, well, we're in it now, so we're both perfectionists, so good
There we
luck to
go.
us.
Well done then. You brought up something like the range of different talents and skills and abilities that the people have who are telling their stories in the book. And it really struck me the importance of multidisciplinary understanding of the climate crisis. And I was wondering if you intentionally baked that in to your plan, or if that just sort of came about.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay.
And I think both Ayana and I are, on the one hand, we've both gone down the path of academic specialization, but just barely. I think we both really pushed the boundaries of interdisciplinarity within our own disciplines. And I think we have a tendency to bring quite interdisciplinary perspectives to this work. We both sort of thrive at the intersections of spaces and topics. And so I think we had that bias for sure going in. And it's reflected in the Truth, Courage, and Solutions subtitle for sure. It's reflected in our own sense that we need poetry to understand this moment just as much as we need hard science and social science. And
there are hundreds of footnotes, all hyperlinked online, should you want to read the original scientific papers that back up the statements in the book.
You had a great format for those too, with all the little dots and things like that. Really was a wonderful way of doing it.
But I think, Lisa, the metaphor that I really like is that with something as complex as the climate crisis, we need a kaleidoscope to see it clearly. So anytime we're just understanding the climate crisis through one person's lenses, it will necessarily be limited and incomplete. And I think we need a lot more of this kind of kaleidoscopic communication approach, because it helps us understand better and more deeply and with more nuance. But I think it also helps people see themselves in the work.
Yes.
I had a chance to teach the book last fall, and that kind of the sharing of people's journeys that Ayana was talking about, like that, watching the sort of vocational light bulbs go off for students of like, oh, this isn't just scientists and policymakers. This is also psychologists and journalists and,
farmers
and exactly. Like there are just so many footholds for doing this work. And I think that's probably the most exciting thing that the book has done is create a sense of welcoming and belonging that I think both Ayana and I have had moments in climate work in our careers of like not necessarily feeling that. And we don't have time for that, right? We need to be calling in as many people as possible with every set of superpowers possible, because we've got a lot of work to do.
Indeed. Yeah. But I love also, you mentioned poetry, and I know we're getting to poetry now. I think we probably need to switch over there. But the mix in the book of essays and poems really allows, I think, a lot of emotion to come through. So it's not just the nuts and bolts of like how you do the work, but the processing of the emotions around that work. And so both of you brought a poem to share with us today. And I wonder, where should we start on that? Who would like to?
I can give it a go.
Excellent. Ayana, and could you tell us the author, the title and author of the poem you're reading?
Poem is by Marge Piercy, and it is called To Be of Use. The people I love the best jump into work head first, without dallying in the shadows and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves, an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were meant to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real. And I just love that poem. I mean, that is, had become, that title, to be of use, had in many ways become my mantra before I found the poem. And so I was so glad to find it. It's just like, how can I be useful, right? There is so much to do. Like, let us each figure out how to be useful, and all of the nature metaphors. And something that we talk about a lot is the importance of doing the work even without knowing the outcome.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, we have no idea what the future is going to look like.
This is not immediate gratification kind
Not
of work.
immediate gratification, and it's not certain, right?
No.
Because it depends on a million other things that we can't control. And I love how this poem's just like, well, obviously, we're just going to do it anyway.
So one of the contributors put a quote from Mary Oliver in her essay that reminds me of that poem, that is, may I be the tiniest nail in the house of the universe, tiny but useful. And so it's now on the wall of my office. So
I love that.
I need to be a tiny nail every day. I don't have to save everything all at once. So yeah, and that poem speaks to that as well. Yeah. Katharine, what did you bring for us?
Yeah. The Mary Oliver quote, by the way, is from Leah Stokes' essay. She also managed to get a Rilke quote in there. So Leah was just sprinkling in a little more poet wisdom. And Leah certainly knows how to be a useful part of this work. This is a very kindred poem. It's called Dead Stars by Ada Limon. Out here, there's a bowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand at the back of all of us. Black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's almost in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash, the rolling containers a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerda, Hydra, Lyra, Lynx. But mostly, we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust, and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean in the spotlight of streetlight with you toward what's larger within us, toward how we were born. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with our synapses and flesh and said no? No to the rising tides, stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, of the land. What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth? If we declared a clean night? If we stopped being terrified? If we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out after all of this is over?
Oh.
And I just, I love the way she kind of casts us in our lineage, right? That for 3.8 billion years of the existence of this planet, dead stars became life, and that life has been ferociously barreling forward to more life. And I think of that life force as the most powerful dynamic on this planet. And it is very literally our inheritance. And I think at the core of it, that's really what this work is about. It is about kind of aligning with life force, and trying to make that not just our inheritance, but also part of the legacy we leave for future generations.
I also just love how she includes these huge universe scale ideas with trash bins rolling around, that it's something so mundane and that we're all used to. And it's a reminder that we're both things. We're huge in the universe, and we're also just taking the trash out.
I love the reminder of agency in that poem as well. Like, what if we decided to say no?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What if we decided to love harder? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we could actually just decide those things.
We rarely talk that way.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so now I'm being told we're getting a little off time. Entirely my fault, because I had far too many questions to pepper you with. But now it's time for
One
the
should absolutely always lose track of time when talking about poetry.
What if we chose to lose time?
What if we just read each other poems for the next one?
Okay, thank you for allowing that. But now I'd like to remind everyone that, of course, this was all very much larger than the four of us on the screen right here, right now. That the One Book One Boulder event throughout the last few months, there's been people all over the city of Boulder reading the book and having these book circles, and we collected questions from the book circles. Thank you so much for people who submitted them, and they submitted questions before the event, which got a little boiled down because we needed to. But we're going to ask you some questions that'll show up on the bottom of the screen, and I'll read those. Here we go, and then let's see about answers. Are you personally feeling grief over what we're losing due to climate change? And in promoting the book and talking to so many people, what have you found most encouraging? Who would like to take this one?
Katharine, I think this one's you.
Yeah, the answer to the personally feeling grief is absolutely. At times in a sort of debilitating way. And I think part of, for me, learning to do this work over the long haul has been learning how to give space to feel the depths of that grief and let it transmute sometimes into rage, often into love, and let that be fuel for carrying the work forward. And it does not work, in my experience, to sort of like tuck that aside and hope it goes away. And In fact, Sherry Mitchell, who has an amazing essay in the first section of All We Can Save about Indigenous prophecy and Mother Earth, I heard Sherry speak a few years ago now, and she talked about how, profoundly connected we are, right? The world's wisdom traditions have been telling us this for millennia. Increasingly, science is catching up. And so, of course, we are feeling what is happening to the planet, right? Because we are part of the living systems of the planet. So this is not only sort of a natural reaction, it's to be expected, because it's how we're hardwired. And I think, to me, the thing that is encouraging in the sense of courage creation is that it feels like the we and All We Can Save is growing every day. Just just the emails that come over the transom to us of people saying, I want to help. How do I help? What is the next step? And that's like a tiny, tiny, tiny sampling of how many people are asking that question in this moment, or even for folks who've been in the work a long time. How do I kick it up a notch? How do I do this more deeply, more impactfully? And I think we really believe that it is the we that is critical. And so that's what gets me moving most days. And also just, in the face of a planetary emergency, like, best not to go it alone. Good to have a climate squad with you.
Ayana, do you have anything to add for that one? Or are you feeling the climate grief?
I spent the last 2 weeks writing an essay for someone else's anthology, summarizing, like, going back to my ocean science training and summarizing all the ways in which climate change has impacted the ocean, like reading the original peer-reviewed scientific literature to make sure I was citing the most recent analyses, and just being like, are you kidding me? We have screwed it up this badly?
Yeah.
Like, what? With just demolishing ecosystems, changing currents, changing the pH of the entire ocean, like acidifying all seawater on the planet by 30%. Like, the changes that we've made to, hurricanes and sea level and ice and coral reefs and all of it is truly horrifying. And this probably says a lot about me, but I actually feel it more deeply when I'm reading the scientific literature than when I hear an anecdote about a specific place or person. And it's the latter that is supposed to help you feel more connected to the emotionality of the thing, because you can relate to the person or the place that the journalists are describing, that's been impacted. But for me, when I see the data, when I see those graphs, I know what they mean for humanity and the 8 million plus other species on the planet. And it's absolutely heartbreaking, because it was a choice on the part of a small group of privileged white men to screw up everything for profit and pull the wool over our eyes, right? To the tune of tens of millions of dollars in marketing to make us all feel like we need to minimize our carbon footprint. So grief, yes, but a lot of other feelings in there too. Like a lot, I will try not to curse because this is a library event, but like expletive.
He read the library guidelines.
And so I think that combination of heartache for the places that I love, heartbreak, as well as knowing the amount of suffering that is now inevitable, that has already happened needlessly, and knowing that that was, something people in power were willing to sacrifice in order to get reelected or raise money or whatever, is truly horrifying. And I think embracing the rage as well as the grief is where we find the power to keep forward momentum, right? Because if all we do is sit in our grief, as Katharine said, like that is debilitating. So what other emotions can we harness, right? Katharine mentioned transforming grief into love, harnessing our rage, right? And I think, another thing that's so exciting about this book is also harnessing imagination, right? Starting to think about all of the different possible futures we could have if we charge ahead with all of these solutions and insights that all these amazing women are offering up. So I think for me, it's like grief, yes, but so many other feelings too. And part of it is honestly just a gift of the brain chemistry I was born and grew up with, that grief doesn't win more often. Like that is luck in part, that I don't get stuck there more readily. So I think the thing that's most encouraging is to repeat what Katharine said. How many people are seeing themselves in this book and in this movement for the first time? People who would not necessarily have thought of their work as climate work, but who are like, oh, landscape architecture is a climate job. And, I could be in the fashion industry and work on climate solutions. Or, I could work in finance on climate solutions, right? There are all these really cool ways to be a part of these things, and even to be a lawyer, but someone who's like a lawyer, very steeped in community in Montana, right? So I think all of that, all those people who are seeing these doors that Katharine and I were working so hard to open for people who are actually like running through them is just super cool.
Excellent. I mean, that started with the question of grief and it ended with some feelings of hope. So thank you for that. The next question has popped up first here. How is gender equity in supporting women and girls a climate solution, and how can we best fight for gender equity? I feel like this is very Katharine focused. Would you like to navigate this one?
Sure. I'll start, and Ayana, you should also jump in. This is a complex topic. Ayana and I took one slice of this around gender equality in climate leadership and did a whole podcast episode back in September. So for folks who are excited about that, I'm sure we can get the link to that in the chat. So folks can go deeper into how critical gender equality in leadership is for the kinds of planetary outcomes we want to see. But I think it's helpful to sort of step back and think about, there are a few different ways that climate and gender intersect. So the Pentagon actually coined this term of climate change as a threat multiplier. That was a few years ago now, and in the context of national security. But I think it's a helpful term because climate change sort of turns up the heat, so to speak, on any existing challenges, injustices, vulnerabilities that are already baked into our society. So climate change, when it hits in people's lives and communities, has a way of making already gender unequal things or inequality that takes shape along other dimensions worse, right? So, for example, for folks who have physical disabilities, it's much harder to evacuate, right? Yes. When a storm is coming. We know there's a gender pay gap. If you've got less money in your bank account, harder to move your family if you need to do that, or to rebuild where there's been a challenge. The list goes on and on and on. And similarly, we need to center justice and equity in climate solutions, because this isn't just, at the end of the day, about trying to bring our emissions down to zero. It is also about trying to survive the world that is coming. And not all solutions lead to a more just future. And so that is really critical as well. And it's part of why it's so important that we have better representation in climate decision making, so that the solutions that get shaped and pursued are genuine solutions for all, and don't kind of replicate the existing challenges we already have in our society. How best can we fight for gender equity? Let me count the ways. One of the things that
smash the patriarchy.
Smash the
Shortcut.
One of the things is really supporting good policy around gender equity, around supporting leadership that is more representative. But there's no simple answer to that question. But I'll let Ayana add in some more layers on this one.
Oh gosh, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I will just, there's a few sentences from the essay that Katharine and I co-authored to open the book that I think are, that really stick with me. And here it is. More than a problem of bias, suppressing the climate leadership and participation of women and girls, half the world's brain power and change-making might, sets us up for failure. So, I mean, how can we honestly solve the largest crisis humanity has ever faced with only half of the intelligence on the planet? I mean, seems like, do we even want to win, And we know that, for example, men are more inclined to take on outsized risk on behalf of everyone. And there's data behind that. And we also know that female legislators more strongly support environmental laws and stricter laws at that. When parliaments have greater representation of women, they're more likely to ratify environmental treaties. When women participate equally with men, climate policy interventions are more effective. Quantitatively, this is not like just feelings. This is like social science data behind all of this. At a national level, higher political and social status for women correlates with lower carbon emissions and greater creation of protected areas. So, I mean, that's how gender equality and supporting women can be a climate solution. And that's really focused on policy. And for those of you who may be following the UN climate negotiations in Glasgow this week at COP26, there was this sort of like cringe-worthy photograph of all the heads of state who were there, and it's like 95% white men. And to me, what that means is we do not have enough ideas in the room. We don't have the diversity of ideas that we need to get this done. It's not just like, oh, diversity and gender equality are like really nice things it's like the right thing to do. It's like, literally, do we want to save the planet from burning / melting at the same time? Yes or no? Okay, yes. Let's just like let all the people with good ideas come to the table, right? And I think the same is true for race, especially when we think about the fact that more people of color in the United States are deeply concerned about the climate crisis and more deeply motivated to participate in solutions than white Americans. It's about 49% of white Americans who are concerned, 57% of Black Americans, and 70% of Latinx Americans. So
wow, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Right?
And that's from the Yale program on surveys, right?
Poland by Yale and George Mason universities. And I think
I'll stick that in the chat.
The thing that's to me the most notable about that is why there's such a huge difference. People think it's because communities of color are most heavily impacted by the climate crisis, which is factually true. But the reason there's this big discrepancy between white people and people of color is that people of color tend to have a more egalitarian worldview, according to this study, as opposed to an individualistic worldview. And so there is this sense that we're all in it together, especially in the Latinx community. Like, oh gosh, it's hitting us and we're all in this together. So what is our responsibility to the greater community? And I think that is certainly something that anyone of any race, of any gender, can harness, that sense of communalism, for lack of a better word, that sense of like, all right, what are we going to do? And the thing that drives me the craziest is when people call our book All You Can Save. And I'm just like, you've completely missed the point.
It wasn't you.
Like, me? No. I'm already done with it. You. We.
Yeah. Well, and it's calling it All We Can Save also gets around the finger pointing that sometimes comes up with climate change or problems.
Sometimes you need to point some fingers just so the average person doesn't feel like it's all our fault, because it's not all our fault, right?
But when it comes to what we can save, we shouldn't be pointing fingers at a particular demographic to save things. If
all
we
hands on
can,
deck.
yeah, we need all hands on deck, definitely. So the next question is up there, and I love this question, but I do want to remind everyone who's online that if you have a question for Katharine or Ayana and you want to add it to the chat, we're going to do our best to get to all those questions before the program ends. So please feel free to add this to the chat. So this question, I have thought this question myself, but I didn't come up with it. Do you think the resistance to wearing masks tells us anything about resistance to effective climate action? Thoughts?
I think just quickly, the last thing that I said, right? Like this sense of we're all in it together. Are people feeling that or not? Is one similarity. And, misinformation on both COVID and climate are extremely dangerous things.
Yeah. Yes to all of that. There's a thing in climate social science literature called solution aversion, which is, that people are like, well, the solution actually seems worse to me than the problem does, which I'm like, you are bananas if you think any climate solutions are worse than the problem. But I think that is something that we see with masks, right? That people are like, I'd rather gamble something that might or might not kill me. Probably won't, might, but the masking seems terrible right here and now. So I'd rather not do that. And I think that is a real reflection of what Ayana was just talking about, of a kind of collective perspective versus like, what feels good just to me here and now in this moment. But I also think, one of the kind of subtexts that I read into this question is that that climate action is inevitably painful and an extra burden. And I think that is an unfortunate framing, actually, that has kind of been brought on by folks who would like us, I think, to not see climate action move forward. But it also reflects a bit of like, this sort of like puritanical American thing sometimes that's like, do this, don't do that, and
So
I just
the good versus bad kind of.
I just saw something on Twitter of someone who probably really cares about climate change snarking at Reverend Yearwood for having gotten on a plane to go to COP and be a moral voice at that gathering. And I thought, wow, we are missing the bigger picture. And so I think, I think remembering that actually so many of the changes that need to happen, like when you look through Drawdown or you look through the Drawdown Review, you catch a glimpse of a world that is going to be manifestly better if it is
Yeah.
peppered with every climate solution under the sun, right?
Mhm.
Where the air is cleaner, where it is easier to move through your city, where buildings are healthier and more comfortable to be in, where food systems are more resilient, on and on and on, right? This is actually something that we should be racing towards with glee, not kind of dragging each other there because like, well, there's just no other way to do it.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
I think
one reason that I
miss-
really love pointing people towards drawdown as a climate educator is that it's not a laundry list of stuff you shouldn't do. And it's like envisioning a future of stuff we do, and so it's so much more positive. And I think that a lot of the stories in All We Can Save are like that. Like, what if we scaled this up, and instead
Yeah.
of one person having this sort of farm, there were 5,000 people with that type
Right.
of farming technique or whatever it is. And I think
Yeah.
that those things are so much more enticing than the what we shouldn't do. But
Yeah.
okay.
And the reality is that stopping things is not going to get us where we need to go.
Mm,
I think Kate Marvel says this so well that most of climate action is about building things,
mm,
and that means it really is an opportunity to design a different world in
innovation.
so many
Yeah.
ways, not just for greenhouse gas emissions.
Mm, quite positive. So we're getting towards that time where we're taking questions from Facebook Live and YouTube. And I see we have Sarah Dawn Haynes. Hello, Sarah. How do you reconcile housing and density issues as climate justice issues? How do you connect social justice with climate?
Want me to start, Ayana? Um, yeah, so I've actually been living this in Atlanta because there's been a lot of debate and folks up in arms about potential rezoning
Mhm.
in the city of Atlanta, which has very low density in a lot of the kind of core of the city, which on the one hand means it's a city in a forest, and on the other hand means that things like workable transit are a real challenge, and I think there's a real opportunity in our cities to address the housing crisis that exists, at the same time that we're able to really radically reduce mostly transportation emissions, but also some building emissions by moving towards greater density. And I think to the extent that we can do that and also have really incredible public green spaces, that's a way forward on a lot of issues that we face in our cities. The question about connecting social justice with climate, I would maybe say, how do you not connect social justice with climate? Because the climate crisis has been born out of a deeply unjust economic system, out of white supremacy and patriarchy, and so that means the only way forward to a climate safe future is by addressing those things too. And I think the profound injustice at the heart of climate change is that the people and also non-human beings who have had the least to do with creating this situation are bearing the brunt of it, and have the least capacity to cope with that oftentimes. So there's really no way to understand the climate crisis except as this incredible planetary and intergenerational and interspecies injustice.
All right, and now we have another question there. Morgan Kemp. Hello, Morgan. With COP26 happening now, do you have any recommendations on how to engage or help the cause during this opportune time? Oh, are you on mute, Ayana?
There's one quick thing I wanted to say about the last question, and then I'd love
yes.
Katharine's thoughts on this one, is that when we talk about social justice, which honestly I'm sick of talking about, because like, of course we need more justice in the world. Like, why are we debating whether or not it's important and connected to things? But to me, it's the lack of understanding that the opposite of white supremacy is not another kind of supremacy, it's equality, right? The opposite of patriarchy isn't suppressing men, it's gender equality. And so I think, like, I just hope that we will all stop fearing the end of these horrible systems that we're living in, because often people are not thinking like what we get instead. And it's the same, as Katharine said, this solution aversion. It's just like fear of change in a lot of ways, because people are not spending as much time thinking about building the future that we want to live in as much as like holding on to like whatever stability they have. And climate and gender equality and racial equality can feel like a shift towards something that's destabilizing, because it is a radical alteration of the really horrific status quo, right? And so I think to the extent that we can spend much more time imagining the what if we get it right piece, which is my new book project, like what if we get it right? Like, what if we actually...
Is that the title? That's a great title.
It's the working title, yes. Like, if
I
we
like it.
charge ahead with all these solutions, right? Like, take Katharine's drawdown 1 and 2 and like use your creativity and think about like, if we did all this stuff, what would we get? You know, as opposed to like, well, I wouldn't be able to drive my car to my private jet, which I don't even have, but if I had it, I would want to get to fly it, you know? I think that's the part that I'm really excited about, is just embracing the opportunity that we still get to create the future in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I think about it, we're the only species that gets to make those sort of long range plans. We have a huge advantage
on the planet too. So it's a big responsibility.
Yeah. Oh, I'm looking forward to that book. Yeah. So I think, do we have a next question to share? Or, oh, wait, sorry, Morgan's question about COP26. And I know, Ayana, I've been seeing you tweeting online. I've been seeing others, like there's a lot of people adding their voices in social media ways to try to engage and help. But do you have any ideas for ways that those of us who didn't go to COP26 or, you know, aren't directly in contact with people who are there, how can we be helpful?
What I've been trying to do is just amplify important voices who are there, but often on the margins, right? Or not there, but have important things to say. I mean, it's a very similar approach to editing an anthology, right? Like, how can we like put help shine a light on important ideas that would maybe otherwise get overlooked. So I've just been trying to like sift through and find some of those gems and share them out. It's sort of like, you know, this crazy impossible negotiation process. I mean, it's like over 100 countries trying to negotiate word by word some sort of agreement. Like, it's like not just like a thing that you can like follow along in detail, and it's actually a process that's very hard to influence in the moment, right? These negotiations have been sort of like gearing up for a long time. It's not like Biden is going there and just saying like, I know, I'll make this announcement because, you know, Katharine retweeted that very like it's already sorted, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to have like a little bit of understanding that this is a lot of it is pre-baked. So Katharine, what do you think?
I would add maybe two things. So one is that our domestic politics and climate policy has a lot to do with what outcomes are possible at COP26. And we still have, unfortunately, climate policy very much hanging in the balance with the rest of the Build Back Better plan. So if you know anybody in West Virginia that Senator Manchin might listen to, this is a great time to nudge folks to pick up the phone and call for climate. There's actually a website, thank you, Leah Stokes, called call4climate.com and walks you through that. Most of the rest of kind of where people are sitting on that is pretty set. But it's a good reminder to plan now to be engaged in the midterm elections next year, because what happens within the US has a lot to do with what is then possible, or other countries are willing to do in international negotiations. And the other thing is much closer to home, which is that with COP going on, folks are more likely to have seen climate in a news article or caught it on TV or heard it on the radio. So it's actually a really great time, I think, also to spark a climate conversation with colleagues, friends, family. One of the crazy things that we know now is that 70% of Americans are either somewhat or very worried about global warming, which is also from the Yale research. And yet there continues to be this eerie silence in day-to-day lives about this topic. And so helping to break some of that silence, spark a conversation, welcome people in, that's all really good, right? And is kind of you've got an easier opening for that in a moment like this one, where
that's a good point. Since it's all over the news, we could take it down and make it local as well. Like around here, but we still haven't gotten snow this fall.
Totally.
Things like that.
And it is really frustrating, right? To feel like, okay, the world is negotiating the future of the world, and we're all kind of just hanging on the sidelines. To Ayana's point, like it is, even people who are there in the flesh are having a hard time feeling like they're able to influence things. Which is just all the more reason that we need to be getting climate leaders into office at every level, from city councils on up.
There's a very cool organization called Environmental Voter Project. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit that is focused on getting every environmentalist to the polls. And I'm completely obsessed with this group because according to their analysis, there were 16 million Americans who were registered to vote, who have environment as their number one voting issue, who did not vote in the last midterm elections.
My goodness.
10 million in the 2016 presidential election.
My goodness. No, that's just wrong.
Million already registered, already have environment as their number one priority. So if we can get those people to vote, regardless of party, we will just we will be electing people who care more, and we will therefore be having politicians who are forced to answer their constituents on this topic, and we will then be able to actually pass climate policy at every level of government. And voting in local elections, as someone who just did that 2 days ago, really matters, because what city councils are doing, what your judges are doing, what your mayor's doing, that's where the rubber hits the road on implementing a lot of these climate policies. So Environmental Voter is mobilizing people using very sophisticated social science data and A/B testing everything that they do. And you can actually know that they increase voter turnout by 2% here and 3% there. We know these elections are turning on 1% difference. So it really, really matters. So for folks looking for a nonpartisan, pro-environment, voter turnout, change election outcomes option, that's one of my faves.
It's it's nice to see it's nonpartisan. I think that that's sometimes rare in
Yeah.
environmental focused voter projects. And that relates to our next question, which looks like what are your thoughts about working for climate change specifically versus working to elect Democrats? And I thank you for your honesty, Lynn Stein. I think that is something that sometimes those two are conflated, and I wonder what you two think about that and what you've seen from, I guess, elected officials of all stripes.
Yeah. I'll just share sort of one insight that I think has been pretty interesting, which is so a lot of the work that Ayana and I do relies on philanthropic funding. And so it's been really interesting to hear from funders in the climate space who for a long time didn't do anything in the political space, have started making significant investments in election outcomes. I live in Atlanta, and there are lots of funders who are like, "Wow, Georgia, I guess it's worth sending some money down there." And I think the reality is that to have the kind of systems change that is needed at the scale and the speed that is needed means changing policy. We're just not going to get where we need to go fast enough with kind of good faith voluntary efforts. Those have been in motion for a long time, and we're
Very
kind of
slow.
sneaking along. And so to me, working on there's a quote actually from Heather McGhee in All We Can Save about how inequality and the climate crisis are the twin challenges of our time, and more democracy is the answer to both. So you don't necessarily, I think, have to think about just electing Democrats, but being involved in working towards more, better, deeper, inclusive democracy in this country will get us to better outcomes, because the climate majority is real. And if we had genuinely representative democracy, we would be moving on climate in a totally different way. And I'll also just add that I think, not all Democrats are created equal when it comes to climate work. And so
And the same goes for Republicans.
Same goes for Republicans.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So making sure that you're really trying to understand the kind of climate bona fides of any campaign that you'd be supporting or volunteering for, whatever the case might be. Or maybe there's some people out there who might want to run for office themselves. I went to high school with a guy who was younger than me and is now a senator from Georgia. So,
wow.
Anything.
Congratulations. Wow. That was an amazing election outcome. I have to say, I used to live in Georgia, and it was just so wonderful to see that happen. I think
Wild.
Next question from Heather. Doing all we can without knowing the outcome is exactly like parenting, with all our hearts, with only our hopes for the best. I really thank you, Heather. That is beautiful sentiment. And yeah. Any thoughts about that, Ayana and Katharine?
I have no children, but I love the sentiment. I have no expertise with which to comment on that.
I don't either, but yeah, I think anything we send out into the world, and I suppose that goes for the world itself. Yeah.
I only have fur children, but I feel like this was true with birthing books also, right? I think most work that is worth doing, even on a small scale, you're taking some kind of leap of faith, right? And hoping that the hours and the brain cells and all the rest, right, translate into something worthwhile. And I think it's, the nature of a systems challenge is that none of us have any idea how our contributions are going really to ultimately impact outcomes. And I think it's why, you know, doing the work that we love with people that we love is really important. Because yeah, there aren't guarantees, but if it feels joyful and empowering in the moment, I think the chances are better that it'll be helpful and good work.
Okay, we have a next question from Miriam. I try to get my health colleagues, patient advocates, and doctors to talk about the connection between climate change and health, but people seem unable to hear it. And she added, I see in the it got cut off there. How do we get through? How do we get through to people about those connections between climate and health? And I guess I'd add probably air pollution and things like that in this too. Not directly climate, but certainly part of the system.
Yeah. It's one of the topics that Gina McCarthy touches on in her essay really powerfully. So I think, sometimes sharing some information that people can sort of digest is maybe helpful. But maybe, maybe starting from a more personal place is maybe an interesting way to begin. Katharine Hayhoe, who also has an incredible essay in the book, published her own book, Saving Us, in September, which is a really great resource for how to begin having more climate conversations and bridging that. And there's a lot of baggage, I think, for people. They feel like they don't know enough. They feel like somebody's going to tell them they're wrong. They're going to step into a hornet's nest of science that they can't get out of, right? Whatever the case may be. And so, trying to create some space where the climate conversation
It also seems like it suffers from that kind of diffuse problem, relating my own personal health to this amorphous blob that is climate change and environmental change. But the personal side of that is, I guess, a good place to start. Thank you.
I think the other part of that is there's the part about reaching patients, but another element of that is just people who work in health. I'm so glad for this question because their voices are so much needed in the public discourse too, right? We need doctors, health advocates, nurses, all sorts of health practitioners speaking up about these connections to the public. So I would perhaps worry less about whether you can convince an individual patient that the health problem they're experiencing is related to climate change than to say, help more broadly all of us, the larger group of people whose ear you have, understand that this is a matter of our well-being and not just, oh darn, that species I'm never going to see anyway is going extinct, right? That this really is a public health challenge, especially when it comes to children. I think about that primarily when I think about this overlap, because these children and their little lungs and their little hearts just cannot take the air pollution and the heat. They just cannot take it. It is so hard on them. And so that's the part that really tugs at my heartstrings when I think about that. And in Gina's essay, Public Service for Public Health, she describes some of that science in a way that folks might find helpful.
Looks like we have another question here. Boulder is a national leader in climate. Pat on back us. If, in your experience, what are good next steps for so-called green communities to take? I think this is something that Boulder, to provide a little context, Boulder is pretty proud of the steps that we have taken, but I think, it's not like we're done. So, what can we do next? A community that has lots of bike paths and public transportation and, access to some really, green energy sources and that sort of thing. What would you recommend?
There was some pretty inspiring news today out of the city of Ithaca, which is committed to decarbonizing every single building in the city of Ithaca.
Wow.
I would love to see Boulder take up that example and run with it, because if we have cities that start to get to 100% clean electricity, that completely electrify their buildings, so no gas stoves, electric heat pumps. Induction cook stoves, by the way, are amazing. Right? Like, there's so much of that happens within the purview of a city.
You're
And
talking about public buildings, not homes or
all
something.
buildings,
All
and
buildings. So
all buildings,
how
all
are they going
buildings.
to change everyone's stoves? I mean, that seems challenging.
So challenging. There are cities that have adopted bans on fossil gas.
Fossil gas.
As
Although, as a
I
former
know
paleontologist, I have a
old
problem with that
habits
term
die
too.
hard. Right, banning gas in
Mhm,
new buildings, but also incentivizing,
mhm,
homeowners, building owners to change out these critical pieces of infrastructure in existing buildings. So I don't know how Ithaca is doing this. I think they're working with the organization Block Power to do this. But listen, if Ithaca can do it, I think Boulder can do it too. And then I think if you really get to the point that you feel like you've done every possible climate solution that a city can muster, then thinking about how you become a hub for learning, and kind of exporting what you've done and what you've learned, that would be amazing. But something tells me Boulder could get after some more challenges before that point.
Okay, so wonderful people online. Anyone with a connection to the Boulder Sustainability Office who would like to offer this Ithaca challenge, we will call it, for the Boulder community, I think that would be wonderful. And you're right, there's always more steps we can take, so that's great to hear. I think we're getting towards the end of our program tonight, and I had one question that I really wanted to ask about it. It's sort of about the fact that this book, All We Can Save, is like a community with lots of perspectives. It's like the really best dinner party that you could plan. And it seems really collaborative, that there isn't one person saying solar panels are the only way and another saying no, wind turbines are the only way. It seems like all the perspectives are welcome and needed. And I'm wondering if you have kind of thoughts to help us end on about how we can foster that sense of collaboration in the community of people that is working to help save ourselves from the earth, or ourselves from the disaster we created on earth, the climate crisis.
I think a lot of it actually has to do with suppressing the ego, so that we can hear other things, right? Mm-hmm. So that we're not just like yelling about what we think, but instead welcoming expertise in whatever form it presents itself, and thinking about how we can weave that wisdom and those insights together into like the whole, web of solutions that are needed. Yeah. Because there's, it's a matter of like, how quickly can we transform everything, right? Right. All these sectors, agriculture, so we don't talk about probably as much as we should, and manufacturing and buildings and transportation and electricity. Like we got to change all of that from a fossil fuel based economy to a regenerative one. So having a little bit of humility about how much any one person could possibly know about how to do all of that, I think will get us a long way. The number of emails that I get to my through the contact form on my website from some dude who literally is like, I have the answer to climate change. I'm like, really?
It's one silver bullet.
You want me to read past the subject line here?
Yeah.
So I think there's this, it's complicated, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And it doesn't mean we can't keep moving forward and accelerate that forward motion.
Yeah. Man, the ego is a doozy. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the institutions that most of us came of age within, schools, workplaces, etc., are not very well equipped for shaping the kind of world that we need to build. Like a lot of us have a lot of unlearning to do, particularly in this hyper individualistic American culture. And I think that's especially true, as Ayana was saying earlier, for white folks. And recognizing when ego, when competition, when this I'm right thing is coming in an unhelpful way, I think is important kind of self-awareness and inner work. But I also think the relational work takes time and takes space to really build that sense of trust. That is often what makes really good collaboration possible. And it's part of why we wanted to find a way, not just for All We Can Save to be a reflection of the community that is kind of rising to meet this moment, a small subset of that, but also to help engender that. And that's why last fall we released All We Can Save circles as one approach for helping to have some more of that kind of more generous dialogue than we often get in the climate space, which can a lot of times feel like I'm going to fact at you and you're going to fact at me and it's my policy. No, it's and that is not very generative soil for things to grow. Sometimes it's necessary, but I think actually realizing that the relational work is part of the work is, I think, a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it reminds me of the saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, which is, as someone who is a weird introvert who is completely sick of having to negotiate things with other humans, it is really disheartening to have to acknowledge the truth in that, but it's just true.
Well, I think you put it well early on. You said we're kind of all in this together. So even us introverts have got to figure out how to do that relational work, because we're not going to get very far doing it alone, I suppose. I think we're wrapping up here tonight, and I cannot thank the two of you enough. It's just it's been an honor and a pleasure to chat with you this evening. And thanks so also
much for hosting us. This has been such a lovely event.
Yeah, really grateful. And we are just in awe of Boulder for having this citywide read. And we remain in awe that All We Can Save was selected for this year. So we're so grateful to everyone who has taken part, read, shared, and especially to all of the heavy lifting that goes into organizing something like this.
Yes.
Shout out to the library.
On that note, thank you, library. Thank you to our ASL interpreters, and including the one that's on screen here today, or right now, David and everyone off camera. I'm going to forget people, but Kathy and Jess and Jamie and Julian, thank you very much for all that you've done. If you'd like to talk with other participants, we invite you to join us on Zoom. About Boulder Public Library is hosting breakout rooms tonight. And if you could complete the survey that's in the chat and share your experiences with One Book, One Boulder, we'd appreciate it. Thanks again to the Boulder Library Foundation.